Last week we looked at some poltergeist definitions and whether such definitions are even helpful. Can something as truly bizarre as a knocking spirit be boiled down to a series of checkboxes on a form? And indeed, would you want to actually bring admin into something like the poltergeist arena? I'm not sure that you would. But poltergeists are also not the invention of the 20th century, nor are they the preserve of ghost hunters or psychics. Poltergeist accounts stretch back through the centuries, even if the spirit responsible isn't always labelled as a poltergeist. Just look at the Tedworth Drummer from the 1660s and the haunting at Willington Mill in the 1840s. That's just as far as England goes. These accounts appear all over the world. So as we're interested in folklore here, let's unpick two vastly different cases from 1716 and 1840 to see how they appear in written records that try to avoid using the P word. Do the accounts even describe poltergeists? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you enjoyed last week's episode, which was all about introducing you to the poltergeist, because it was about the fact that Ghost Law was coming out, my new book with DK, and by the time that you're listening to this, the book will already be out in the UK and it came out on Thursday, so that's very exciting. But the other thing I did as well, and this is just to give you a heads up for next week's episode, I did actually re-watch Poltergeist from 1982 yesterday, which possibly wasn't the best thing to do during Storm Floris, because obviously all the bangings and crashings and weird noises around the house really did add to the ambience of the film, which I have seen so many times, because it does appear as one of my PhD films. But somebody asked if I would have a look at Poltergeist in terms of how it relates to recorded phenomena. So that is what I've done. So that is going to be what we're going to have a look at next week. So if you're interested in film or horror cinema or anything like that, then that will be the episode for you. But this week, like I said in the introduction, we're looking at these two different cases from 1716 and 1840, one of which we have briefly covered before, but I'll explain that when we get to it, because I wanted to have a look at how folklore appears in the pre-20th century period, but also how they kind of appear in the written record. And it's interesting to me to see how people actually note these things down. But before we start, I wanted to mention yet another poltergeist typology. And Claude Lacouture refers to a typology of poltergeist that was originally drawn up by Ernesto Bazzano, Benjamin B. Woolman and William G. Roll in 1982, which was later revised twice more. Now obviously one problem with any typology is the exceptions to the rule that end up not featuring. But it is still quite interesting to see what they came up with despite that. And they analysed 116 poltergeist cases, which included 32 examples of apparitions and 6 cases that included voices. The actual overall typology suggests that, and this is just in the list format, the phenomena focuses on one person, objects move towards specific targets or they follow a strange trajectory, objects can pass through solid material like walls without damaging said material, voices, visions, raps or other forms of communication may be present. Exorcisms do nothing. Disturbances often stop if the person of focus leaves the building. Phenomena can happen at any time, day or night. The duration is rarely lengthy, and objects involved can sometimes end up hot enough to burn. And yet, surprisingly, there is no mention of the spontaneous fires, electrical issues or sudden appearance of water that we find in Alan Gould's definition that I did mention last week, which also includes an idea of some kind of attack on fabric, so it's often torn or ruined in some way. Musical instruments might be played on their own, or there might be the imitation of voices, among other things. Obviously, there's also things like people being attacked in and having bite marks and things like that. So the two sets of definitions do vary. And I did find it noteworthy that many of the criteria involve words like may or can, because it is a typology, not a definitive statement. And I think that's quite a helpful way to approach poltergeists in general, but definitely in the pre-20th century period, because there are common points between examples, but there are also wild differences as well. And this is where we're going to have a look at the two examples to see this in action. So we're going to start with the John Wesley poltergeist, and before anyone says it, yes, I am claiming that as a future band name, but it does fascinate me that the family of John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, experienced a haunting that sounds a lot like a poltergeist in the early 1700s. We're going to have to go back to Epworth in Lincolnshire to have a look at this. And John's father, Samuel Wesley, moved to the rectory in the village with his family in the 1690s. There was lots of damage done to their land, and then eventually there was also a fire in the house, potentially caused by locals trying to drive Wesley out. And in 1709, the rectory burned down completely and had to be rebuilt. Just 8 years later, when Wesley's son John was 13, the so-called haunting began, although it's worth noting that John was not present at the time because he was away at school in London. And the first he learned of it was correspondence from his mother. Now, it all started innocuously enough on the 1st of December 1716 with moans coming from the dining room door. Various raps and knocks began sounding around the house, and Mrs. Wesley assumed rats or mice were to blame. Having previously had success in chasing them off by blowing a horn, she tried this tactic again, and rather than it working, it seems that the noises actually got louder and clearer, and she realised that this was no animal. The family then prodded Samuel into speaking to the spirit. One of the daughters thought that they'd angered the spirit by using the wrong form of communication with the horn. When Samuel entered the children's room, moans and knocking greeted him, and this was really the first time that Samuel actually experienced anything. And the spirit couldn't answer his question as to why it was haunting them, but it did knock 3 times. Samuel asked it to knock 3 times again if it couldn't actually speak, but the spirit fell silent for the rest of the night. On other occasions, Samuel rapped a specific pattern of knocks when he entered a room, and then when the family gathered to pray, the spirit would repeat Samuel's pattern. Now, we obviously know this as the knock once for yes, twice for no approach, but I should point out that that actually had a precedent in a haunting in Lyon in 1526, so that particular code is actually quite an old one. But the family also heard footsteps around the house that were so noisy, it was as if many people walked the upper floors or ran up and down the stairs. The family also believed that they'd seen the spirit in different forms because Mrs. Wesley thought she'd seen it as a basset hound, while a servant saw it as a small rabbit. And I think in both cases we could go, if you're going to see a spirit in any form, basset hounds and rabbits are probably 2 of the more innocuous forms that a spirit could adopt. I think I'd be quite okay with both of them. Now, the haunting actually ended without any kind of warning on 27th of January 1717, although John's elder brother, also called Samuel, continued to collect information. His sisters provided him their own account, mentioning an array of knocks, groans and squeaks, and they also related the way that electricity seemed to dance around anything metal in their bedroom on one occasion. Mrs. Wesley actually didn't consider the servants to be responsible. They'd only actually hired them in November, but they were often present during disturbances and apparently seemed terrified by what was going on, so she completely ruled out the idea that it might have been them. Surprisingly, the family themselves didn't actually seem to live in fear, and Mrs. Wesley kept coming back to the idea that animals might be to blame, and Samuel Wesley seemed to find it all vaguely amusing, which is quite surprising. John himself later collected accounts of the haunting that he'd missed, although any account by his sister Hetty is absent, and this is a shame because it does appear that many of the disturbances followed her around the house, so if she was indeed the focus, then it might follow that this was a typical poltergeist event. Although that doesn't explain why Samuel Sr. was the only one to be physically attacked. Based on the typology that we looked at the start of the episode, the case certainly has some of the hallmarks of a poltergeist, because it appears the phenomena focus on one person, although that is debatable with the physical attacks on Samuel Sr., but there were plenty of knocks and raps used as a form of communication, and very deliberately used as a form of communication as well. Now, while I doubt that the Wesleys tried an exorcism, the fact that Samuel Sr. was a clergyman did nothing to shift the poltergeist. And it also lasted less than 2 months. So true, it could have been another attempt by locals to persuade the Wesleys to leave, although obviously some of the phenomena, like the dancing electricity, are quite difficult to explain using that particular theory. But it does sometimes make you wonder, if the phenomena is going to go on for like a couple of months, would you even really bother with an exorcism? Because, I mean, some people wait longer than that just to get stuff sorted around the house, particularly if you've got a fairly rubbish landlord. So I kind of feel like maybe you'd be better off just sitting it out. I don't know. But it is quite cool that Samuel Wesley Jr.'s subsequent investigation helped to preserve the accounts. And as we shall see in our next case, published accounts also allow us to investigate a so-called poltergeist from a distance. And this is the Bishopwearmouth poltergeist. And you might remember when I did the Sunderland Ghost Stories episode, I came across the story of a poltergeist in Bishopwearmouth in 1840, and the story focused on 13-year-old Mary Jobson. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back and have a look at that again because of the fact that one of the visiting physicians actually collected together a bunch of accounts and actually published this as a booklet with all of the testimony from various witnesses and people who'd come into contact with the event. So there's actually loads of information available about this in that one source from such a range of people. So I thought that it might be quite worth having a look at it to contrast it with this one experience by the Wesley family. Now, Mary fell ill, and while that was relatively commonplace in the early 19th century, what happened next was not. Now, obviously, poltergeists had seemingly targeted young girls before. In 1810, such a haunting apparently plagued the house and shop of John Chave in Samford, Peveril, Devon, and the knocks and footsteps seemed to focus around Sally Chase, a teenage servant. She suffered invisible blows and managed to grab the spirit on 2 occasions, describing it as being like a rabbit or dog, and a servant boy in the property also saw the apparition of an old woman. The rector of a nearby village, Reverend Charles Colton, even came to spend time at Chave's home, and after 6 nights he testified in front of the mayor and 3 surgeons that he couldn't account for the phenomena, though he was careful not to be drawn into saying that ghosts were behind it all. The subsequent tit-for-tat in the newspapers between Colton and the journalists echoed with the ridicule of the Cock Lane ghost hoax of 1762, and newspapers at this point took great delight in exposing such fraud. And if it wasn't for Colton writing about it, it's likely it would have faded into obscurity, but it does show that there was a girl at the centre of the haunting. And this brings us back to Mary Jobson. So her illness began on 9th of February 1840. Now, she had had an attack of illness a fortnight earlier, but the February bout marks the start of the phenomena as well. But we need to start with her symptoms. And one of the doctors, R.B. Embleton, described her early symptoms thus, and I quote, "On my first visit, she complained of severe pain on the back part of the head, increased on pressure. Her eyes were very sensible to the light and slightly injected with blood. She had a sensation of sickness but no vomiting. The heat of the skin was a little above the natural temperature. Her bowels were constipated and her pulse about 120 but very weak and frequently irregular," end quote. As you won't be surprised at all to hear, leeches did absolutely nothing to help, especially since some of those symptoms sound a lot more like a migraine. But poor Mary seems to have gone absolutely through the ringer, both with her symptoms and the subsequent treatment. Obviously, her symptoms worsened, with her face apparently drawn on one side, her pupils dilated, and convulsions began on 9th of March. So you can see why our parents kept calling a doctor in. But then we also have the phenomena that was going on at the same time, and this sounds fairly standard for a poltergeist. There were loud knocks from near the bed, followed by scratching, and Dr. Edward Drury noted that the knocks came in 3s. Doors opened and closed on their own, and music even came from nowhere. Another visitor reported that Mary's hands and feet were above the covers when the knocks happened, seeming to confirm that Mary couldn't be the one making them. The sounds of swords clashing rang out in the house, which is one that I've never come across before. But apparently Mary's mother grew so used to the phenomena that she actually sat knitting while it went on, which just makes her sound like a woman after my own heart, really. But cold water appeared in puddles with no obvious source, while a witness remembered 2 mugs going missing and only reappearing later. Although, to be honest with you, if that was a sign of a poltergeist haunting, I would have one here permanently, because I'm forever putting things down and forgetting where, and then like them reappearing later when I remember where I've put them. So I'm not sure how much I buy into that one. But all of this pales in insignificance alongside the voice. Because not only did Mary hear voices, but she also seemed to be the source of a voice that no one recognised. This particular voice spoke too fast for anyone to take the speech down in its entirety, but the accounts all recall how the voice was not Mary's own, but it was rather loud, strong and weirdly sweet. Another visitor noticed that Mary's lips didn't move when they heard the voice. One person described how it wasn't a masculine voice, but it wasn't a feminine voice either, so it was quite difficult to place whose voice this actually was. Now, obviously, voices were not new in tales of knocking spirits, and according to Giraldus Cambrensis, a spirit manifested in the home of Stephen Worlett in Pembrokeshire in 1190. This spirit threw dirt, but more importantly for our purposes, a disembodied voice spilled all the secrets that the locals would rather keep hidden. Voices also characterised the Bell Witch poltergeist story in the 1800s and the Enfield poltergeist in the 1970s, although obviously the latter would have had no impact in 1840's Bishopwearmouth. Now, also for the pop culture inclined, you might remember the so-called demonic voice featured in Ghostwatch as part of the haunting, where the parapsychologist tries to get the girl who supposedly is the source of the voice to actually make it while she's not in a trance, and she seemingly can't. And if you are interested in all things Ghostwatch, I do have an illustrated talk about that landmark TV drama if you're interested, and the link is in the show notes. But what's fascinating about the voice in the Jobson case is that no one actually suspected demons or devils, and people instead came to assume that some angelic force spoke through Mary, and one witness even describes the voice as being angelic. This association with Jesus perhaps explains why the phantom animal spotted in the house was a lamb. The voice even related information that people didn't already possess. Now, in this case, it wasn't anything bad as it was in the Pembrokeshire version, but this time Mary's father, John, related how the voice had recited the family trees of both him and his wife. Neither of them knew the particulars of this beforehand, but then they investigated what had been told to them afterwards and actually found that the voice had been right and the details were correct. Mary's mother, Elizabeth, also reported that a neighbour had been mocking the case, so the voice actually ordered her to be sent for, and having seen and heard the phenomena herself, the neighbour left a convert. Now, one of the reasons why there's just so many accounts is because there were quite a lot of visitors, and respected surgeon William Reid Clanny was one of these. And he obviously came for two reasons. One was to actually check on the status of this very ill girl, and the other reason was to experience the phenomena for himself. Clanny had some serious credentials, being a senior physician at Sunderland Infirmary, but also the physician ordinary of the Duke of Sussex. He'd even invented a sealed candle lamp to cut down on explosions within mine workings. Clanny went on to publish two versions of his report on the phenomena, including eyewitness testimony from both the family and a slew of doctors and surgeons, and the very fact that he did this, knowing it was probably going to lead to some kind of ridicule and potentially damage his reputation, does go some way to show how much he actually believed it was genuine. It is worth noting that one of the witnesses was Dr. Edward Drury, who I mentioned earlier, who was the same doctor who went to investigate the haunting at Willington Mill. What is also bizarre is that Mary promised that Dr. Clanny would experience supernatural activity after her recovery, and 3 knocks woke him one night, but the failure of his dog to react convinced him that this was the sign that had been promised. Mary later revealed knowledge of what had happened and how his wife had reacted, which obviously Mary couldn't possibly have known, and this further convinced Clanny that the phenomena was real. In terms of the actual haunting, much of the phenomena seemed to occur after the doctors tried to administer medicine and it didn't work. The voice insisted everything was a miracle and that medicine would be useless, and was therefore trying to stop the doctors from inflicting what actually sounds like quite barbaric treatment on poor Mary. But the voice also predicted that the events had an expiry date, and true to its word, Mary seemed to be cured on 22nd of June 1840. The descriptions of this actually sound quite harrowing because the voice tells them to lay out her clothes, and it really gives the impression that it's the clothes that she's going to be laid out in, as in that she'll be buried in. So they all kind of leave the room, and then when they come back in, Mary's actually gotten dressed and she's sitting on her bed with her baby sister on her knee and she's absolutely fine. So that sounds like that must have been an awful thing to have prepared yourself for, that you were going to come in and find your daughter needed to be laid out in her burial clothes and then find that she's actually fine and playing with her little sister. That must have been a really strange experience for them. But was it actually a poltergeist case? Arthur Morrison didn't actually consider it one in 1891 because he actually lumped it into his category of possession. And this isn't just simply demons, it's basically any case in which a departed spirit enters or seems to enter a person who's still alive, and then the spirit uses it almost a little bit like a sock puppet, as it were. He does note that many cases are probably more likely a mental health issue, and does admit that there are some cases that defy explanation, and for him, Mary Jobson actually fell into the latter category, that he couldn't quite explain what it was. But there were phenomena that fell into both the earlier typology and Gall's definition, because the events focused on one person for a short period of time, and the phenomena often also happened during the day as well. Objects would seemingly move on their own, and people heard voices, raps, knocks, and other sounds. Obviously, look at the swords clashing that people heard. Clearly no one tried an exorcism because they were convinced it was a religious miracle, so you don't have the element of fear in this particular case that you do in other poltergeist cases, because of the fact that people are convinced that either an angel or even God himself is talking through this really, really, really poorly girl. But then if we use Gall's definition, we have the percussive sounds, object movements, a sudden appearance of water, the apparent playing of musical instruments, because people did say that they could hear music, and the imitation of sounds, and I think that's probably what the swords clashing came from. Obviously there's no attacks on people and there's no outbreaks of fire. They're missing from the reported accounts, but we do have quite a lot across both of those definitions that do occur, so it does make me think that it does actually sound a lot like a poltergeist case, even though we can't definitively say one way or the other. But what do we actually make of these two cases? Clearly they do have points in common, such as the knocks, the attempts at communication, the short duration of events, and the apparent focus on one individual. But the main point of difference for me is the intention behind them. And that was what I said last week, that the difference between, say, fairy activity and of turning the house upside down and so on, and poltergeist activity is the intent behind it. And there's definitely more of a malicious or malevolent intent behind it with the poltergeist compared to fairies. And I think that this is where the intention behind these ones shows the same thing. So the Wesley poltergeist seems a lot more classically chaotic, whereas the Bishopwearmouth poltergeist has no real destructive element other than Mary's illness. So there is still pain and trauma, it's just it's only inflicted on this one person. Now, Mary's full recovery is clearly a happy ending, although it does raise questions as to whether the illness was somehow responsible for the phenomena. And it also doesn't explain why, if she was then therefore possessed by an angelic force, why she had to be made so ill in order to then act as a mouthpiece for this particular being, and why all the other phenomena was therefore present. That bit is never really explained. Now, only the Bishopwearmouth poltergeist can potentially be influenced by the media scrum following the Cock Lane ghost, given the amount of effort made to record eyewitness testimony. Yet both Samuel Wesley Jr. and Dr. Clanny attempted to check the trustworthiness of their witnesses, although Samuel at least sought alternative explanations. One of the things I quite like about both of them is they do stop to go, could it be the servants? Could it be this person? What's going on? These people are surgeons. We must be able to trust what they say. And I sometimes feel like that bit's missing from a lot of modern ghost hunts, because obviously if you're on a ghost hunt involving the public, you can't exactly turn around and say, I think that person's making it up because they're an attention seeker, even if it's quite obvious that the person's deliberately making all the activity be about them. You can't really question somebody's trustworthiness in the same way that I think these accounts did. But I do think that the divergence in phenomena also reflects a variety in poltergeist accounts as they appear in folklore rather than the far more standardised description from the 20th century onwards. So in the same way that descriptions of fairies changed when their appearance on film and stage changed, is it possible that hauntings are described using language and representations derived from popular culture as much as they are what actually happened? So in other words, a haunting's not simply the work of a ghost or spirit, but hauntings themselves are haunted by our awareness of other hauntings, which all gets a little bit meta. And that was partially what I was actually looking at in my PhD when I was looking at how haunted houses are represented on film. And you did start finding that much of the later horror films after the Amityville Horror were very much haunted by the way that the house was presented in the Amityville Horror in 1979. And I sometimes feel like that's what's happening here. And as I've told this story before, when I was on one of the ghost walks in Greyfriars Kirkyard, and this one particular woman inside of one of the mausoleums announced to everybody that she could smell sulphur. Most people wouldn't know what sulphur smelled like. You'd be far more inclined to say, I can smell rotten eggs. You wouldn't say sulphur. But of course, somebody who had watched a lot of ghost hunting programmes who associated sulphur with something demonic would be far more likely to say that they were smelling sulphur, which I find really interesting, because it does then make you wonder how much of these contemporary hauntings actually just simply being pieced together based on what people have seen on the telly. So it does make you wonder. And this is why media literacy is so important. So when you see people like me analysing films or TV programmes and someone jumps in the comments going, oh, it's not that deep, it actually is, because humans take so much of their cues from about how to behave from what they see and what they experience through other people's experiences, if that makes sense. So people will relate things according to what they've seen in films because that gives them the language to do so. And that's where I think these two examples are so interesting, because the Wesley poltergeist obviously predates the more famous Cock Lane ghost by about 50 years or so, whereas the Bishopwearmouth one appears at a time when you start to get a lot more of these stories being recorded, like the one at Willington Mill. So it's just all stuff to bear in mind when you are looking at folklore accounts. It's like, what has it been influenced by? Who has written it? Why was it written down? Why did anybody think to publish it and stuff like that? So as always, a little bit of critical thinking goes a long way. And you can still read them and enjoy them and go, wow, that sounds bizarre. And you can still do both things. It's brilliant. You can still enjoy horror films and go, yeah, that's really cool. And then spot when people are using that in the real world. I have actually heard a ghost hunter claiming that really nasty ghosts have been known to keep other ghosts hostage. And I'm like, no, that's Poltergeist 2. That's literally a film plot. So just keep an eye out for these kind of things, that they will start to pop up as you start looking for them, because obviously that's just how the brain works, isn't it? Anyway, I've gone on a little bit too long now. Speaking of films, though, like I say, we are looking at Poltergeist and how it represents poltergeist phenomena and actually gets quite confused in the process. So we'll have a look at that next week. And you might wonder what that's got to do with folklore, but I do say in the introduction that we will be just looking at anything that's weird, so it kind of falls into that category. I do also need your help if you've listened this far. And you may remember that I did some listener ghost stories back in October, and I want to do that again for this month, but I don't want stories about things that people have experienced this time. Instead, I want to do a little bit of folklore in action and just collect stories that you've actually heard. So everybody will have heard one like your school was haunted, or there was a particular house that people always hurried past because it never seemed to have an occupant for very long, or there was a particular part of an office building that nobody ever liked to go into, and so on. There's people hear these things all the time and they just kind of accrue them and then they don't get captured, so that's what I'd quite like to do. So I've got a Google form which just asks a few questions about what was the story that you were told. It can't be the kind of thing where like, oh, I came across this on Reddit or someone told my mum. I'd prefer it if it was something that someone had told you, like a story that you were told when you were at school and things like that, because I think then that way obviously we're not too far removed from the source of the story. If you want to remain anonymous, you can, because I will be reading these out on the podcast. If you'd rather hear your name, obviously by all means put that in. And yeah, so the link to the Google form is in the show notes. And obviously depending on how many I get, I may do 2 episodes, I might just do 1. It all depends on how many you lovely people send me. But I just thought, again, it's a really good way to capture these things for posterity. And if you've also been told anything really weird, where you're like, I don't actually know if that was a ghost, it might have also been something else that was supernatural. Like, for example, a story that you may have been told may have also involved, for example, the good neighbours or something. By all means, put that one in as well, because it's basically the wider supernatural. But yeah, so hopefully you'll have something really cool for us on that one. And bonus points to anyone who has a story about a grey lady, because we all know how much I love grey ladies here on Fabulous Folklore. But thank you very much for your time. Apologies, this one went on a little bit longer, but these 2 cases are quite huge. So there we go. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope that you come back next week to listen to the episode about Poltergeist, the film. And then obviously I'll see what we end up doing after that, if it's more listener stories or if we'll have another topic before we go into listener stories. But anyway, it's been marvellous chatting to you as always, and I'll speak to you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.